Is an IEM that has a macroeconomic structure that is modeled through an intertemporal optimal growth model that's hard linked with bottom-up representation of the energy sector. Key characteristics of the model is that it has endogenous technical change by learning by doing and learning by researching. And here we really try to adapt this modeling framework in order to take into account this adaptation, mitigation, feedback through the use of energy. And we do so in multiple steps. First, it was necessary to go from global mean annual temperature and temperature increases to regional annual temperatures. So a first module update has been done in this sense in order to have regional climate variables. A second advancement has been linking to a statistical emulator regional mean temperature increases and levels into the occurrence of extreme events. In this case, we use the occurrence of extreme temperature days, defined as the number of days in a year below 12 degrees, 12.5, and above 27.5 degrees. And we select these two indicators because they are the ones that have been used by the empirical literature to actually understand the impacts on energy demand. And this is indeed the third, let's say, model advancement that has been endogenizing these impacts of high extreme temperatures on energy demand across fuels and across sectors. And of course, then the energy demand affects the economy, which is described by a production tree through changes in the productivity of the energy inputs of the economy. And we'll discuss about this implementation in a second. And then finally, instead of, let's say, just looking at the demand-side implication, we really investigate what are the implications of this additional energy demand on energy supply, and most importantly, on the mitigation policies that are put in place. So in this case, we consider a current policy scenario, and then two alternative ambitious mitigation scenarios in which we have a fixed carbon budget that is achieved through uniform global carbon taxation. So these are the two, let's say, more ambitious mitigation scenarios, achieving 2.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees, respectively. So more in detail on how we endogenize this impact. So we have, we start from the empirical data, and we translate the shocks into the economy through changes in the productivity. So assume that we are considering a cooling energy shock, meaning that we need more electricity to cool our homes. We feedback this in the model by saying, by changing the parameter of the productivity of electricity services. So that essentially we need more electricity to have a given level of output. So we need to have more electricity for a given level of output. Consider this as sort of technical retrogression of the specific energy carrier. And of course, we also include changes in the productivity of oil and gas, depending on that are related to both cooling and heating needs. So in terms of the empirical analysis that we use, we have, as I briefly mentioned, a differentiation between three sectors: residential, commercial, and industry. So first, with respect to the previous with respect to previous modeling assessments, what we change here is that we don't only look at the building sector, but we also have industry, which we argue is quite important in terms of the overall magnitude of the impacts that we find. And secondly, we don't look at, we don't have as a driving variable of climate impacts CDDs or temperature, which are typically used in these assessments, but we really want to use extreme temperatures because we want to consider the full tails of the distribution of the possible weather realizations in the future. And we believe that considering these tails can help us not incurring problems of aggregation bias and possible underestimations of the impacts when we only use annual mean temperatures, for instance. So we have the, responses across sectors and fuels. This is only one particular study that we are using that was fitting our needs in terms of geographical scope and sectoral scope, but the modeling, the modular structure of these type of implementation also would allow to then include other empirical evidence once it becomes available. And we're actually thinking about expanding this as well. So in terms of the results, first looking at demand-side shocks, we have an increase in electricity demand as expected due to cooling needs, both from buildings and in industry. And we have a really slight increase, essentially no real change in liquids and gases demand. And this is important because typically models project a decrease in fuels due to the decrease in heating needs. But here, as we also are accounting for industrial sector needs, the empirical analysis tells us that cooling in industry can also happen through processes that use gas and fuels, and these requirements counterbalance somehow the decrease in the fuels used by buildings for heating. So we have a compensation effect, and this somehow affects the results and the magnitude of our shocks. So in terms of numbers, what we find is a 18% increase in electricity demand up to the end of the century. And we find extreme heterogeneity across regions, with Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA region being hit the most in terms of relative changes of energy demand. Now, in terms of the supply side implication of this, as we have just seen, the electricity sector is the one hit the most. We just consider and we focus on power generation. And here you can see the mix of the additional capacity that is installed with respect to a scenario model run with no adaptation feedback. So here we only have the mix of the additional capacity that is installed, and on the bottom you see the actual values of fossil fuels additional capacity. So here we're really taking the difference between what the model would project as an additional new capacity, and then the projections when we also include this adaptation impact. And what we see is that, at least in the first 20 to 30 years, there is a high reliance on fossil-based capacity. And then, of course, the mix is shaped by the ambitiousness of mitigation policy scenarios. And we have much larger reliance for this new adaptation-induced capacity on solar, wind, and storage. But the key is that in the up to 2050, we are projecting an increase in fossil-based capacity of around 50 to 55 gigawatt per year globally, which is roughly 1% of current installed capacity, and it's roughly what has been added in terms of coal or alternatively gas-fired capacity every year in the last 5 years on average. So we are essentially saying that when we include extreme events implication on electricity demand, we're really essentially doubling what we would need to invest in fossil capacity in order to be able to provide electricity to everyone as we are projecting. And in terms of costs, here we look at and we differentiate between power system costs and fuel costs. So these graphs want to give the idea of the trade-off that there is between these adaptation requirements and mitigation policy. So on the left, you see the results of the model runs without the adaptation feedback. And displayed is the energy system costs in terms of net present value, the incremental energy system costs that are associated with mitigation policies on top of the current policy scenario. So we have across different ambitiousness of mitigation policy that you can see in terms of global temperature increase. So if we move consider the top left panel, if we move towards the left, we have a smaller increase in global mean temperature. That means more ambitious policy scenarios. And here we're asking how much, in terms of net present value energy system costs, these additional mitigation effort cost with respect to the current policies. And we have that by moving towards more ambitious scenarios, we have higher costs. Now, when you compare the left graph to the right graph, you see what happens when we include the additional costs related to adaptation. And as you can see, there is a reduction, and we are even projecting a net benefit of pushing the energy system towards stronger decarbonization with respect to the current policies. And this is because the current policy scenarios entails really great costs in terms of adaptation-induced energy system costs. Thank you. So when this trade-off is taken into account, we see that the, let's say, benefits of ambitious mitigations are really accounted for, and therefore provide different pictures in terms of energy transition costs. We don't see a great difference across fuels cost, because as we've seen, the different sectoral drivers balance off. Now, in terms of emissions, in the current policy scenario, when we don't have any carbon budget constraint, we see an increase in the cumulative emissions from 2020 to the end of the century of 7%. So roughly 350 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emitted more, only related to the adaptation needs or the energy required for adaptation needs. And in the scenarios where we have a fixed carbon budget, there is, of course, a net zero effect on overall on the economy, across the economies, but there is a difference between them, and you can see it on the left. So that countries where the marginal abatement costs are lower than have, let's say, lower emissions increases. So there is a cost optimal somehow reallocation of the emissions. In terms of the co-benefits of mitigation or the somehow costs, health costs of adaptation, which I know it sounds strange, and again, here we're only considering a specific part of the story, which is the cost of adaptation. We're not taking into account the benefits, which would, of course, be extremely relevant. But in terms of the air pollutants emissions, we see that the increase in generation in fossil and dirty generation capacity in the next 20 to 30 years in specific regions, especially in Africa, entails a higher emission of nitrates, of carbon monoxide, and of sulfur dioxide. So we have an increase in pollutant, which is non-negligible, between 5 and 10% in each in different regions. And although we don't quantify the health implications of this, we also reinforce the importance of also considering the cross benefits of mitigation, and in this case of coming from the reduction in adaptation induced emissions. Finally, the last slide of results focuses on the impacts on the mitigation policy. So, thank you. In the ambitious mitigation scenario, the ones with fixed carbon budget, the global carbon tax ensures that we meet this budget, and once we include this energy feedback, we have slight to relevant, depending on the scenario, increase in the global carbon tax. That is roughly 5% over time in the most ambitious, well below 2 degree scenario, and is up to 30% in the least ambitious policy scenario. Of course, in terms of number, it would be, for instance, going from $44 to $57 per ton of CO2. So here we're considering important relative increases. Now, in terms of implications, we believe that this type of work should, of course, be expanded. First, by improving the empirical basis of the results. As I told you, we are just relying on one particular empirical study that has its own advantages and limitations. So we're planning to expand the empirical basis. Thank you. And also conduct multimodal method comparisons. And of course, other sectors where it would be really interesting to look at the implication would be the water sector, water treatment and water supply related to adaptation, which has also implication in terms of energy, electricity, specifically demand. And looking also at maybe more regional assessments, which can be more details in the type of empirical shocks that can be found. And I'm happy to take any questions about this. Thank you.
Hello, Chris Smith from University of Leeds. I think this is absolutely fantastic work. I sort of really wanted to do this kind of thing myself, and you've done it brilliantly. Can you, yeah, can you explain a little bit more about how you develop the climate projections, so global and regionally, in this work?
Yeah, thank you for your comment. So, in terms of both going from global temperature to regional temperatures and from regional temperature climate extremes, we rely on empirical analysis that allows us to have response functions that link, in one case, global mean temperature to regional, and in the other case, regional to climate extremes. So we have these emulators. In the case of, let's say, the most important for this study, which is the projections of climate extremes. We have annual level observations of a large global panel for roughly 40 years. And we conduct first a cluster analysis across different tropical, climate areas. So we have tropical countries or let's say more temperate countries, but we leave the clustering to the algorithm. And then we have, as you can slightly see, specific response function for these clusters. So it's a rather simplistic approach. It's like a really direct emulation. But then we also compare our results with the type of CMIP5, for instance, type of projections of the same variables, and we don't find great differences. So we believe that still this approach, although it's quite direct and simple, can be used in IAMs. Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, Jan Kilkari for ETH Zurich. So I'm quite happy to see what you're doing, just like Chris Smith, because that's something that we've been trying to do for pretty much decades. So I'm developing actually Mesmer X, so maybe you heard about it, because that's this emulator to go from the output from MAGIC climate to regional climate, to have some gridded projections, including like natural variability. So if you want to have some climatic streams, that's what we are developing at the moment. So we'll be very happy to do some stuff there together.
Thank you. That would be great. Yeah. Indeed.
Yep.
Thanks.
I'm Nicola Ranger from Oxford University. So could you talk a little bit about the applications of this? So you've sort of presented it very much in the framing of integrated assessment models. So does that mean you see the main application feeding into sort of international climate policy discussions? Or do you also see applications at a national scale in terms of planning, for example?
Thanks. So in the case of this particular exercise, we're using macro-based shocks, which are pretty aggregated in time and space. So we believe that this type of framework, yes, can inform mostly mitigation policies and in a type of large modeling framework. At the same time, moving from a more aggregated approach to a disaggregated approach in terms of regions, but especially in terms of the frequency of these shocks that we are considering, then would really inform regions on power system resilience. So moving from annual impacts to hourly shocks of a heat wave, then let's say the empirical analysis, the empirical evidence there is beginning to improve because we have more available high-frequency data sets from, for instance, for Europe, from NSOE data sets. So we're beginning to use that type of data. And then there is a need of coupling these type of shocks with power dispatch and capacity expansion models. And in some cases, we have in the literature examples of this for specific regions, mostly the US or Brazil. So we have examples of that. But of course, that will be probably the way forward in order to be able to inform the industry on the costs. So yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Our next speaker is an in-house speaker, so to say. It's Adriano Vica from IIASA.
Yeah.
And he will talk about the energy land-water nexus and impacts on that.
Should I put it? Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for inviting, and good morning, everybody. My name is Adriano Vinca. I'm a research scholar here at IIASA in the Energy, Climate, and Environment program. And today I'm going to talk about how we included water, energy, and land climate impacts and adaptation strategies in IAM scenarios. And starting from a little bit of context, different approaches of including climate impacts in IAM. I think many people here in this room have worked a lot in the past on top-down economic assessment of climate impacts, namely damage functions. And this is just a picture of one of the first, very simple, coming from the DICE model, but these have evolved in years. I'm not really an expert of top-down approaches, but I think these are very versatile for IAMs because they can kind of easily be included in models. Some of the limitations are, for instance, sectoral coverage or regional heterogeneity of climate impacts that can be potentially included, but in literature it's not been done so much. Other approaches, especially in the last years, are bottom-up and biophysical approaches of different sectoral climate impacts. And this is definitely more data and resource intensive, but there are actually quite many studies in literature. These are mostly usually specific sectoral studies. For instance, crop yields, studies on effects on food production. Actually, we saw also yesterday a presentation, or power plants cooling, or air conditioning cooling, impacts of climate change, and also health-related and mortality studies. What we do in our research group is to include and explore different policies on water, energy, and land sectors in integrated assessment model. And in particular, I work on the Message IX Globiome model, in which basically we explore also, for instance, SDG goals in different sectors. And this seems to be a good opportunity to also integrate climate impacts across different sectors with a bottom-up approach, in order to have, at the end, overall more integrated frameworks that can explore and show the interaction between sectors, having these impacts all in one integrated model. And the Message IX Globiome is an integrated assessment model. Maybe many of you know about it. It's a long-term dynamic optimization model that minimizes total system cost, and has been widely used for exploring and studying climate policies, because it has a comprehensive representation of energy supply, demand, but also coverage of all greenhouse gas emissions. And it's linked to a macroeconomic model, Globiome, which also represent the basically all land sector, agriculture and forestry. And within the project, in the Navigate project, also together with PBL colleagues working on an image model, we have been expanding this IAM, including, in particular in our case, also a water module, which with the representation of the water infrastructure, supply, and link to hydrology, in order to be able to represent in our model different sustainable development goals targets, namely related to for specific goals like food, including healthy diet and reduction of food waste, but also in the water, we include targets of water efficiency improvements, environmental flow constraints, and also access to actual clean water and sanitation. And for the energy sector, we try to represent increased electrification and phase out of traditional biomass, as well as the AC cooling gap, so basically AC cooling demand that is likely to increase, and also finally biodiversity targets. But on top of this, in particular, in this project, we have been also including specific climate impacts for two different RCP scenarios, 2.6 and 6.0, that try to connect also to the SDG measures we have in the model. So one question could be, how do you select these impacts, and why just these? Well, these are the most, let's say, relevant in literature, most explored, but also those that more directly connect to the SDG policies we are interested in studying. And now I'm going to go through some of these impacts and explain how they connect to SDGs, and also what are the adaptation strategies we include in the model that relates to these impacts. And first of all, one of the major uncertain but also most impactful variables in our models are related to hydrology, for instance, runoff or groundwater. You can see here uncertainty of a LPGML model on runoff data for some of the major basins. And since the unit is cubic kilometer, these are really large amount of waters. This directly affect SDG 6 goals in terms of water access, but also food-related goals because of sustainable food production that requires irrigation. And adaptation mechanisms included in our model are the inclusion of non-alternative water sources, so non-conventional, for instance, desalination, water recycling, and deep groundwater extraction that are basically alternative to renewable groundwater. And this other figure is basically showing for the two different RCPs, 2.6 and 6.0, how across different basins there are also differences, and there is not a really common trend. Like in some region might be drier for RCP 6.0, other might have actually higher precipitation for the coming decades. So there is really heterogeneity across basin around the world. One limitation for our framework related to this is that one component of our model has only annual time steps and not sub-annual, so seasonality is actually here not well considered. And one solution to that is that we only consider and aggregate these monthly values with using percentiles. In this case, we would use the 90th percentiles to only test then our model to basically test model resilience for low water availability scenarios. Because aggregating just average values would lead to overestimating water availabilities. Another important climate impact that we include in the model, and actually yesterday there was a nice presentation about this, is crop yields. This is also quite heterogeneous across regions, but also across crops. And this figure on the top shows for maize and wheat for RCP 2.6 and 8.5. You see that for different climate regions, there are actually very different trends. For instance, for maize, yields are likely to decrease, but for wheat, some regions might benefit actually of temperature increase. And this is another figure showing similar concept from Bias et al. For 1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees increase, a more aggregated indicator, but shows how some region actually benefits of crop yield increase and other will have actually crop yield reduction, but with temperature increase, the magnitude of change is definitely increasing. And this, of course, affects SDG 2 and also biodiversity targets because of crop competition with natural land. And how we adaptation mechanisms, including our model, are related to crop shifting, and also to basically choosing between irrigation or rainfed in order to compensate for yield losses. Another aspect, also presented as yesterday by my colleague Alessio Mastrucci, is AC cooling gap demand. Here we see for message regions cooling demands in 2020, and also in light blue what is actually currently an unmet demand, so we call it cooling gap. It's like some regions that are potentially would have demand, but it's currently not met. And especially South Asia and Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa show a very high magnitude of cooling gap. And looking at projections for SSP2 in 2050, we see how basically this demand is likely to increase. These lines are the 2020 values. And so demands are definitely likely to increase, but also we see for different climate scenarios how there is an impact of climate on expected demand. In particular, RCP 6.0 shows higher demands because of higher temperature increase. And this is also included in our model. There is not really an adaptation strategy on this in our model, but other colleagues work more on building a message modules that might explore that better. Hydropower potential is also likely to be strongly affected. This is a figure from Gernot et al. Also for these two different RCPs, and you see how magnitude of changes in hydropower potential are higher for RCP 6.0, but also here we see regional heterogeneity. Some regions actually benefit of higher precipitation, at least in the next decades, and therefore it's really hard a priori to say how climate impact would affect globally this sector. But for sure it affects energy production and climate targets as well, and in terms of adaptation, the model is mostly then choosing between different supply options. And another climate feedback are concerning desalination. In this case, I was doing a quick analysis on regretting the desalination potential with other variables like GDP and water stress. And here we show actually quite low impacts of climate, which are the different lines, either global or the different basins. And finally, last but not least, power plant cooling is also an important aspect we consider. Actually, it's been widely studied in literature, and we actually include it just in the model in terms of cooling capacity factor reduction, taken from Van Vliet et al. Having gathered all these climate feedbacks, we studied a set of scenarios that look at three different dimensions: climate forcing or mitigation pathways, sustainable development goals, and climate impacts. In this case, we fixed to SSP2 scenario in order to keep the socioeconomic aspect fixed and just see what happens while changing these other dimensions. And two other additional scenarios look at basically, the first two only focus on no climate policy, no additional SDG effort, and with or without climate impacts. And then we have basically the same set of scenario with SDG objectives on top of that. And then only considering fixed climate impacts, we also include mitigation targets. In this case, the reference RCP is of course different because we achieve RCP 2.6. And yeah, I will skip it. It's just to say that we try to align across image and message with many SDG goals, but there is more information on an online poster from my colleague Mohammed on session 47. And so some preliminary results. Actually, there are various different questions that can be explored with this set of scenario. And here is the first figure. What are the implications of meeting SDGs with and without climate feedbacks in the model? And this figure shows basically across different indicators that connects to SDGs across different sectors, how achieving SDG goals basically would lead to changes in these indicators compared to a baseline, a no policy scenario. And the two columns are with or without climate feedbacks. And the dots are different regions or the world. And like as a first side, you can see that in this case, the two bars are always pretty close. This means that climate feedback effects in the model are smaller in extent compared to SDG policy effects, which are the whole bars. But in terms of sectors that actually show major changes are electricity production, land cover, and irrigation water withdrawal, so mostly land-driven sectors. And from the regional perspective, regions that are more likely, of course, to be affected by these impacts are South Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, which actually are also the region that mostly benefit from the SDG agenda, but also the mostly affected. Another interesting possible analysis is related to cost, and this is also quite preliminary because there is a lot of dimensions to be taken into account, and this is a figure in which I tried to compare a mitigation scenario to a no climate policy scenario, in this case both with climate impacts. So in theory the models should have a response in terms of adaptation in the case the RCP is leading to water scarcity or other strong feedbacks. And we can go through some of the sectors. For instance, in the energy sector, we see some regions that are resource exporting regions that are likely to reduce their overall annual expenditure when compared in a mitigation scenario. Other regions are likely actually to increase because they have to transit to renewable production, and these are more similar to traditional investments on climate policies. But we can also look at other sectors where we see the effects of climate impacts, like reducing costs because of irrigation withdrawals or increasing costs of afforestation. And in these results, the water sector seems to be less sensitive, but we see that for climate mitigation scenarios, there is in general less requirements of water infrastructure and less costs. This is another study that I skip now, but it's also carried by another colleague, and it actually doesn't focus on climate impacts, but on climate mitigation and SDGs relations. And just to draw final considerations, because the results are still preliminary, I don't want to give you final conclusion on those, but consideration on the overall work. So including multi-sector climate feedbacks in IAM is actually doable, increases the complexity of the whole work. It's a pretty complex machine and model, but in my opinion also improves the reliability of climate and SDG policy analysis. And I think it would be interesting to discuss also with you how these bottom-up approaches actually relate to other top-down approaches, if they are complementary or they are just overlapping too much and they have to be distinct. I think it's an interesting point. And still work in progress for us is to actually explore more the detail of cost and investments analysis, and understand better causalities between climate feedbacks and the other policy targets, because now we all consider all together, but studying, for instance, those one by one would give us additional information. And of course, doing a lot of model sensitivity, because each of these sectors I mentioned actually show uncertainty, but also we have a machine to actually explore uncertainty in different sectors. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. Time for one or two questions, maybe? If there is no urgent question, then thanks again.
Thank you.
And we move on to our final speaker, Adriano. Sorry. Adriano said, Alfred from King's College. I'm very sorry. From King's College, who will talk about land system dynamics in the SSP, but with a very different modeling approach. So this will hopefully be quite complementary to the talks we had.
Great. Hi, everyone. Let me just do the bump while you're... yeah?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's perfect. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my name's Ol. I'm a PhD student, final year PhD student based at King's College London. So I work with James Millington and Tamsin Edwards there. And this work that we're going to present is, the product of two research groups. So our team at King's and then the team at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, led by Mark Rounswell, who you can see at the back. Give us a wave. Great. So what are we going to be talking about? So we're basically talking about two kind of what we might hopefully pitch as a new class of model, a geospatial behavioral land system model. So that's a horrible mouthful, and we'll be sort of exploring what we mean by that. But these two models are WHAM, which is a model that I've been developing, the wildfire human agency model, so it's been developed for human fire management in the first instance, and Crafty, a model developed at Karlsruhe. And we're going to be talking about how these models can be used to explore climate change adaptation and mitigation, and the feedbacks between those things in real time. And we're going to talk about how we've been overcoming one of the major challenges to using these models at large spatial extents. So that's representing spatially explicit indicators of a wide range of human capitals, human indicators. Yeah, and then hopefully through that we can talk about how these models can be used to explore integrated scenarios and perhaps also picked up on by other modelers. So what are these models and why use them? So basically what we're talking about is agent-based models but scaled up to run over large spatial extents. So if you're a vegetation modeler, perhaps this is a useful analogy. If you're going to model a particular plant community, you might have all kinds of very detailed processes represented in your model. But then if you want to scale that up globally, you're going to have to simplify a bit. But the advantage of these types of models is that the kind of agent-based model that you might run at the landscape scale, you can keep many of the benefits of that once you scale it up to run at large spatial extent. So here we have a kind of idealized version of what an agent-based model of fire management in a landscape might look like. You have people interacting with one another, conflicting, looking at what their neighbors are doing, imitating, interacting with state agencies here, like the Forestry Service, and reacting to perhaps incentives coming from policymakers as well. And we have heterogeneous agents here, different kinds of intensities of land use and so forth. And so what behavioral land system modeling is doing is taking this and trying to scale it up. So here's an example of that, which comes from the Crafty model developed at Karlsruhe. And so this model's been applied to look at trade-offs between climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation. Here, obviously, for the United Kingdom. And so what we can see is in SSP1 here, we have a large amount of area given over to this sustainable agriculture type. So you might think of that as a kind of an organic farmer or a kind of agroecological land user type. But there's a kind of unintended consequence that emerges from the model, right? So we actually have less native natural vegetation ending up in the SSP1 RCP 2.6 world because this is quite an extensive land use practice. Whereas, ironically, in RCP 585, we end up with more native vegetation because we have very intensive farming, where farming is used. And then in the middle, we can see SSP 3.6.0, we end up with like very extensive pastoral farming. And when Crafty's been applied to Europe, you end actually up with kind of societal collapse as an emergent phenomena in the model under like conditions of very, very low availability of human capitals and a re-emergence of subsistence agriculture. So the model I've been developing, WHAM, the Wildfire Human Agency model. Now, fire is obviously both an adaptation question for humans, but also, I'd argue, a mitigation question that provides a very substantial constraint on reforestation potential, but potentially also on things like soil carbon, which does get disturbed in fire. And here you can see that, we've in order to drive the distribution of the agent types in our model, we're not just using socioeconomic factors, but we're also using ecological factors. So we're using the Human Development Index, market access, which I'll discuss a little bit more in a second, but also biophysical drivers that determine how people use and manage fire. And so our agents are able to perceive both the changing environment and the changing socioeconomic conditions alongside each other and react to that multifaceted changing environment. And here, you can see an output from our model, just from the land use module of it. And what we're referring to here is kind of strategies or attitudes towards fire management. So industrial is the kind of fire exclusion, sort of helicopters and fire trucks sort of approach to fire that is like always bad and should be excluded from the landscape, which has kind of been the dominant paradigm of fire management in Europe and the USA, whereas pre-industrial might be actually using fire productively in agriculture as a land management tool. And then post-industrial, this emerging kind of pyro-diversity narrative where fire is used as a kind of management tool, perhaps drawing on indigenous knowledges. So we're able to represent this kind of specific aspects of varying aspects of the land system in these models. And WHAM, which has currently been designed for fire, you could reapply this to soil carbon or water consumption or whatever. So these models, as I should have said, are kind of hungry for spatial data sets. On the one hand, it's great that our agents are able to think about or perceive their environment in a nuanced way. On the other hand, that creates a challenge, right? And that we need a lot of very diverse spatial data sets. And just to sort of explore that a little bit more from the point of view of the Crafty model, so Crafty kind of conceptualizes drivers, socioeconomic drivers of human behavior as capitals, but these are not kind of just capitals like finance. They can be knowledge or social networks. So, for example, agricultural innovations being taken up by farmers, perhaps adaptations to soil management or something under climate change. Well, if you have a stronger social network, stronger human capital, then perhaps that adaptation might be taken up more quickly in that scenario than otherwise. And as well as these capitals that we're describing, we also have a very wide range of ecosystem services that can be under demand in different scenarios. And so we have here recreation, as well as carbon sequestration, livestock products, and the things you might ordinarily think of as products of the land system. And we have water regulation as well. So that's another kind of regulating ecosystem service that we're able to explore. So by encoding these things as capitals in our scenarios, we're then able to think about, well, what capitals could we project globally in order to run these models at global extent. And so we've begun the laborious process of making a lot of projections of different human capitals under the SSPs, up to 2100. And these can be complemented, the ones we show here, by relevant biophysical capitals. So in our case, we're thinking about fire, so we might want to have the flammability or the available of flammable vegetation, because that's going to affect how people use fire as a land management tool, for instance. Or the group at Karlsruhe currently thinking about looking at land demand for SPV, so obviously incoming solar radiation is going to be relevant there. So so these can be supplemented by relevant natural capitals, and here we have economic, social, human capitals, which draws on the UN Human Development Index. And we also then have manufactured urban capitals. And so what we're doing is we're projecting these things spatially at 1 kilometer resolution. And where possible, we're making use of existing projections where not, we're doing them for ourselves. And the idea is that this could become a sort of repository of spatial human capital projections that can then be drawn on, by land system modelers, but potentially by other modelers as well. I'm just going to show you some examples of these projections that we've been doing. So here's, this was done by one of my colleagues at Karlsruhe. So this is manufactured capital, describing energy consumption per capita. And essentially we've taken the IIASA regional energy demand projections, and we've downscaled them using work done by Owl and Data from Oxford University. And so then we're able to project that forwards using future population trends and the future trends in energy demand projected by IIASA. So far, so simple. So here's another one that we've done. So this is health. So this is based on life expectancy as projected by the UN. So the Human Development Index, those of you familiar with it, contains health, education, and economics. Here's just showing the health index of those three. We take the UN's life expectancy projections, calculate the Human Development Index from that, and we downscaled it using existing subnational data on the Human Development Index, which has been published in the literature. And then we take, great, thanks. And then we take the Gini coefficient to adjust within country variability, within country inequality through the different scenarios into the future. And so you can see that one of the consequences of that is we actually end up with higher health outcomes in SSP1 than in SSP5, and that's because in SSP1 the index saturates, but in SSP1 you're tackling that within country inequality, and so you end up with a marginally higher, better outcome. Finally then, so market access, so this is describing, well, what it says on the tin really, how easy it is for an agricultural producer to access economic markets for their products. And we're still working on this at the global extent. So here's some work that was done by my supervisor, James, looking at the soybean production system between USA, China, and Brazil. Here you've got the Mata Piba region of Brazil, and we're looking at the growth of both the road network and of soybean ports that are used by farmers to export their products to China. And as you might expect, over time, as the importance of that global soybean trade has expanded, then so the cost of accessing one of these markets has decreased. And just sort of to say as an aside, this is the kind of system that, again, that we can explore through land system modeling, very complex, messy system where global commodities trading can play out at the local scale in terms of the land use change in sort of complicated, non-linear ways, not least when we have global scale trade disruptions, and then all of a sudden the USA is providing many less soybeans to China, and then that has very complicated spillovers in terms of the land use in Brazil. Okay, so to finish, we've presented a couple of models, Crafty, a kind of general purpose land use model, and WAM, model I'm working on that allows you to look at just specific aspects of the land system coupled with vegetation models. And we think that these models allow you to explore in real time trade-offs and impacts between adaptation and mitigation, and they allow you to represent human decision-making in real time from the bottom up. They allow you to represent the good, the bad, and the ugly of human decision-making. They allow you to represent bad outcomes and what can go wrong. So a big challenge to using these models over large spatial extents has been the forcing and the driving data. We're tackling that, and we're looking to share this repository as a kind of community resource. And then we're interested to think about and explore with this community how this work could be adopted and drawn on by others. And with that, I'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? In the very back.
Andy Challoner, University of Leeds. Thanks. Nice talk. Have you run either model historically to see if the emergent properties of the model are observed in the real world?
Yes. So the poster last night, which I can share with you. So for WAM, my model, we've run it historically, and the great thing about fire is you've got really good remote sensing data to evaluate against. And yeah, so it leads to quite a big jump in the performance of the UK Earth system model's potential to ability to reproduce observed fire. So something like a 20% bump in the performance of Jules Inferno at reproducing observed fire patterns. Mark, I mean, it seems crazy for me to answer questions about your model when you're sat there. So with Crafty, it's not my model, but that's the case for mine, yeah.
I'll talk to you later on the IPP.
Yeah.
Were there questions?
Thank you. Excellent talk and an excellent approach. I like one idea, basically sharing an idea. I think some of this could be linked, like in the previous presentation, to a model like LPGML, where it could inform either some of the fire behavior and modeling that of fire behavior, or of land use change. So I think there could potentially be some linkages there. I don't know if there's LPGML experts around here, but I think that could be could be an interesting link.
Definitely, I don't know why I didn't talk about that. So yeah, no, that's a really helpful point. Thank you. So one of the advantages of these models, right, because they're running at the same resolution as dynamic global vegetation models, is that you can directly integrate them. So we've integrated our model with Jules from the UK Earth system model. The Crafty team worked with LPJ Guess, I think, and Peter Alexander, if you're at the Human Earth System Interactions session later, has been working on an ensemble with LPJ Guess and a model called Plum, which is a broadly behavioral model as well. So yeah, no, thanks. I really should have covered that in my talk. Thank you. Yeah.
Any further questions?
Yes. So, yes. I'm a social scientist, so I'm coming from a different perspective. But I've just been listening to 4 presentations now about all this modeling. And now you are sitting there, but it's also a question to all of them. It's actually, what I wonder is really that it seems that everything is possible. But coming from a social scientific perspective, I know how difficult it is to measure all these things. So how come can it be that you are all guys focusing so much on what is possible, how to fix it, and optimize the models rather than focus on how difficult it is actually to do these things? To be a little bit more modest, to say actually this is almost not possible to measure all these things, calculate it, quantify it into one model.
Yeah, let me start by agreeing. But I think I started by saying we're scaling up, so we are losing information globally. We're not able to represent this kind of level of detail that you might if you spent. Oh, it's gone. Never mind. At a landscape scale agent-based model where you're representing maybe 1,000 people and you go in and you do surveys and you spend time in the community, obviously you can capture more information there. We think it's important to scale up so that you can look at macro-scale issues and spillovers and unintended consequences of sort of national scale or international scale policies. But I think, yeah, and sort of to add to that, like one of the things that behavioral models allow you to do is to reduce your ambition about land-based carbon dioxide removal, because you're looking at the land system as it really is, messy, horrible. I talked about the case of Brazil, China, and the USA, and when a USA president just decides to have a trade war with China, that leads to deforestation in the Amazon, and yet we're saying that we think the land system, which is this incredibly complex beast, is going to be a vital tool through which we tackle climate change. Well, I would agree there's potential there, but only if we're serious about how it really works in its spatial messiness. So I really agree with you. We are losing information, and I think we need to be honest about that. But I think that behavioral land system modeling is a new tool that allows us, I think, to get more of the kind of information that you're talking about into the models. That's the best I can do.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe this also leads to a few more minutes of general discussion. We are almost out of time, but we also started a little late. So thanks again. And I don't know if maybe there's a reaction of other modelers in the room on this question, or other remarks generally of people who are interested in using integrated scenarios, or any other remarks to all the speakers on this topic of integration with all the questions and challenges which were raised. Any further points? Yeah, over there and then in the back.
Thank you all. I'm Henrik Karlsson, Stockholm Environment Institute. I also have a more general question. Presumably this session was about mostly integrating adaptation and mitigation, but there was a question before about different policy levels. And in many cases, mitigation is mostly a national issue, whereas adaptation is a subnational issue. So when I talk to policymakers, they are more interested in, for example, studying trade-offs and synergies between, say, mitigation and monetary and financial policies rather than mitigation and adaptation. So I was wondering if the community is trying to integrate other policy areas rather than trying to just look at mitigation and adaptation. Thank you.
Any responses or feedbacks?
Hi, I come from India. I just wanted to add on to what he has just mentioned. So in our organization, we study national level mitigation policies and also help with the states to come up with their own state action plan on climate change. So both of these need to be reconciled, and a lot of times what we observe is that the states want to fund more of the adaptation policies while the center focuses more on the mitigation. And this reconciliation has been a long and difficult exercise between the state and the center. So I think reconciling it in the model is the step one to go to the ultimate policy space in the end. So it's a real question that needs to be addressed.
Is this in response, or is that a new point? Okay. Any further responses? Then I would go in the back, because that was the next on the list, and then.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to the point about social variables and the complexity, the social complexity. I mostly do national level models rather than global models, national and subnational. So I can just reflect on some of the challenges there. There are existing patterns of behavior. There are potential new patterns of behavior. There are institutions and institutional changes that can happen. And some of those can happen very rapidly that can alter the underlying assumptions of the model. I would say that's actually kind of key to the motivation for something like shared socioeconomic pathways, however well or poorly they were done, that you try to look at a wide variety of possibilities. You try to, given those kinds of uncertainties that are extremely difficult to model, how do you incorporate possible trajectories? I'll just add that in some other sessions, people have been doing semi-qualitative methods where they bring in those kinds of things. But I would say you never fully escape the difficulty of trying to capture rapid and large changes in human institutions and social norms. So it's a challenge, but one that I'd say I personally welcome. I think a lot of the people I've heard speak would also.
The point here.
Yeah, thanks. So just an observation, really. Lots of very nice talks, alternative frameworks for thinking about incorporating adaptation challenges into scenarios, but all, to some degree, taking an approach of adding sensible empirical estimates of climate damages into an integrated assessment modeling framework. No talks on starting from an Earth system modeling framework and then thinking about what an agent-based choices or adaptation frameworks might look like represented in the self-consistent world as represented within an Earth system model. My open question is, are we missing anything by not representing that sort of self-consistent climate picture that we only have within an Earth system model?
Interesting question.
I just feel, yeah, I mean, we're working towards tightly coupling our model into the UK Earth system model so that the inputs, biophysical inputs, come from the UK Earth system model and our outputs go back into it. So we should be able to run to the end of the century, at least for the case of fire, internally consistent climate change, socioeconomic change, fully coupled runs with feedbacks between those two things. So that's what we're working towards. It's not easy, and so far all we've managed to do is break the model. So.
Just as a sort of thought, maybe sort of picks up on a couple of the comments. And so one thing that I don't feel that I've heard enough on in this session, and actually a number of the sessions, is the use of this. And to answer questions that we've been asking here, the answer to those questions will depend very much on what's the use case. So what is an appropriate modelling framework for if you're a local decision maker looking at fire management versus if you're thinking about global temperature trajectories versus if you're thinking about national planning, will be extremely different. And I don't feel that we've acknowledged that enough in this discussion and really thought about this is a particular use case, what's the appropriate modelling framework for that? What's the appropriate level of rigour that's needed? What are the appropriate things to bring in? Now, I work a lot with governments. Nationally, I work a lot with financial institutions, and those two are about vastly different. So I just wonder, how as a community can we bring in, more the focus on the user and particularly in how we select scenarios and the appropriate scenarios that we use, coming back to the core theme of the conference, is extremely different depending on the different type of user.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree. As a response, I think it's also, we're with the integration, we're still at the beginning. So before we are at the point of saying, okay, in this use case we need this, and that use case we need that, we need sort of to be able to even model these different things and have them available. And I feel like often we are not there yet, but at the same time, I think right there when a lot of models start this or still in the early phases, we can actually shape this a little bit and think about, in the vast uncertainty of impacts and the very different channels of impacts, which we will never all be able to all represent, do we focus on something with a use case in mind and sort of pick this now? I think that would be a useful way to go to avoid this sort of overwhelmingness of the impact side. Maybe these two more points, and I think we have to conclude.
Yeah, just a quick, a really good point about users, but just a quick point on that. If you're going to do that and start with the stakeholders, you have to also speak to the people in the other fields who are having conversations with those stakeholders. Otherwise, you just become a competitor amongst a whole bunch of people trying to attract the attention of busy stakeholders who have stakeholder fatigue. And in order to do that, you have to demonstrate the value of your model. So to kind of repackage my earlier question to all, really, it's about saying, here's why you should believe my model, maybe even also saying, here's why you shouldn't, presenting a balanced case, but then just being honest about looking across at other people who are trying to address that same stakeholder group. And actually, in some cases, your approach may not be the best approach, right? And someone else's might. So more communication across communities for this sort of moving more towards users might be a useful approach.
And there was one more hand.
Yeah, maybe very quickly. So I work for the Rocky Mountain Institute, and we work a lot with sectoral change initiatives and national governments on developing decarbonization strategies. In these analyses, we sometimes use models, and we use different types of models for different purposes, depending on the communication and the kind of impact you would like to generate, the conversations that you are having. And I think like one thing that I took from the conversation so far is quite a strong trend towards having a single big model with big assumptions, even though in those kind of conversations you use different types of analyses which are developed in a different kind of way. So I think that kind of thinking is, I think, something that would also be quite useful. So that you don't necessarily have a single model that tries to do everything and integrate everything, but cherry pick specific models with specific purposes for specific audiences and specific questions to answer those kind of things. So not a single model that can answer all the needs of a single stakeholder. So that's one of the pieces, like in practice, how we use that in developing decarbonization strategies for sectors or for national policymakers. That's how those conversations, in my experience, are facilitated. So maybe that provides some useful context in the translation of those results for different types of conversations.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I think we could talk about this for a long time, but I think we have to come to an end. Thank you very much for all of your discussions. Thanks to all the speakers. I would also like to draw your attention to the online posters which we have for the session. There is a number of them, I think 5 or 6, which might also have some be of interest to you. Thanks to my co-conveners, some of which are in the room and some are online. And yeah, see you around in the afternoon.